since October 7, but also a long time before that, international law has been one of the main arguments against both Israeli actions in Gaza as well as in Judea and Samaria, and in some cases across all of Israel. Today, joining me, Adam Mosso for the Daily Objective. Adam is a professor of law at Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University, and he's also an expert on intellectual property law with a special focus on patent law and innovation policy. And I wanted to have him here as a lawyer to discuss the idea of international law and oh, I can hear myself. Oh,
Sorry, no, that's,
no,
that's
okay.
my that's on my that was on my side. I apologize.
No worries. The idea of international law, and yeah, so I would immediately go to you, Adam. As a lawyer, how do how would you explain to people sort of what it is, and how would you separate it from, I don't know what you would call it, like domestic law or sort of like local law?
Yeah, so thanks, Daniel. Thanks for having me on. And as a preliminary matter, I just want to say I am a law professor, but I'm not a specialist in international law. I know a little bit about it, and I bring a legal training and legal understanding to these types of discussions. But I don't teach it and I don't publish in this area. So I just want to make clear what my bounds of expertise are, and that and what in what people should uh, how people should account for what I'm saying. So so I think there's two different things that we need to think about with respect to international law, kind of like, okay, how we assess it objectively, and conceptually, and is it a legitimate concept and things of this sort, and then kind of how it's being deployed. And of course, how it's being deployed and abused is related to the answer to the first question. And so let's first kind of talk about the first question a little bit. So, what is international law, and is this legitimate? Is it a legitimate concept? Well, so remember, so a law is a rule guiding social conduct, right? That is backed by the coercive force or power, the coercive power of the state. And so that's kind of the end of the day, kind of like the what what makes a law compelling and gives it its authority is its moral content, but also the coercive power of the state that backs it for those who breach it. And in this respect, international law is not a valid concept because while there are these rules or norms that people are adopting through various treaties, like the Geneva Convention Against Genocide in 1947, and the law of armed conflict, and international humanitarian law, and which are these kind of terms for these general collections of various treaties and that various countries have adopted. There's no, the UN isn't a government. It doesn't have a military force or an army to back its rules between states. And so it's really not law in that sense. These are norms. These are general ideas that people are appealing to, but they're calling it law. They're trying to give it the force or meaning of law. They try to create pseudo enforcement mechanisms between the treaties in terms of, the ability to impose various conditions on various countries and punishments on countries through trade sanctions and other types of things like that, as a way if you breach it. But it's not truly objectively a legitimate concept in international law. And I mean, um, and so it's fundamentally, it's an invalid concept, that is not validly formed. We shouldn't think of it as law. We should think of it as, well, maybe there should be some rules or doctrines that generally govern us, and the source of those rules should be ideally individual rights and and norms of that, and other kind of moral norms and socio-political norms that derive from these more fundamental foundational political concepts like individual rights.
Yeah, and something to remember about sort of, yeah, I really dislike even the concept of international law, not to mention because there is not really a thing. There is a bunch of treaties that some governments sign, some governments don't, but all of them are sort of treated as, this is like international law. And I understand there is such a thing as sort of like customary international law, that even if a sort of like country doesn't sign to it, there is like an understanding. But when it comes to, I mean, you mentioned about sort of, let's say, when we go to actual law, sort of domestic law, you it should be based on individual rights, but also you can apply it objectively. And one big problem I always have with sort of international law is if the basis itself might not be correct, how can you ever sort of like try to be objective about it? I can like give a specific example, right? When it comes to Israeli sort of engagement in Gaza. So uh, when you have international law, first it sort of gives obligation on both sides. So let's say we are talking about Israel bombs a hospital or one part of the hospital. Well, if you go to Geneva Conventions, certain buildings like hospitals have a protection and cannot be targeted. But there is also an obligation on the other side, Hamas, to designate those hospitals as like a separate thing. So not don't have your military targets that don't have soldiers there. And so you have these things where I oftentimes try to check sort of under specific Geneva conventions. Okay, Israel did that action. Was it right under international law? And even when I'm trying to be sort of objective, I could say, I mean, technically they were, right? Hamas put something in there. Israel striked that hospital, but didn't destroy the whole thing, only targeted that specific part that was a threat. Yet, when we look at how people generally apply international law, it's almost one-sided against Israel. Sort of Hamas is almost never to blame.
Yeah, all right. So again, this shows you kind of the non-objective nature of this discussion because see, there isn't such a thing as international law that governs war. There are different treaties and different types of international law. And this is the non-objective nature of it that's being exploited in the Gaza war. In the general Israeli-Palestinian conflict going back decades. So there's two different types of international law. And I learned this because I'm not an expert on this. But I learned this in speaking with people who are experts on it in the law professor mission to Israel last summer. So there's international human rights law or international humanitarian law, which are these kind of general rules that govern how states act towards specific individuals or their citizens and citizens of other countries outside of a war context. Wars are governed by an entirely different set of treaties called the law of armed conflict. And so, by the way, these are being conflated and mushed together because, like, for instance, international humanitarian law says you don't get to blow up hospitals. The law of armed conflict does not say you don't get to blow up hospitals. And in fact, so this is again, it shows you how non-objective this is being and the difficulties you're having in getting answers to these questions. Because everything Israel has been doing in Gaza, everything Israel has been doing with respect to the whole conflict with Hamas and Hezbollah going back decades is consistent with and comports with the law of armed conflict, what's called LOAC, as an acronym by internet experts in international law. The the and in fact, that was something that I learned when meeting with IDF lawyers and meeting with government officials in Israel. Like they take their obligations under international law far, far more seriously than any country or military that I've ever known. And we had one of the members of our mission to Israel was a former army officer in JAG Corps and now a law professor who specializes in these things. And he was shocked at the level and degree like to which they went beyond their obligations under LOAC in terms of governing their soldiers and the actions of their soldiers in armed conflict. The problem is that people with respect to the Palestinians, or I should just call them Arabs, because this whole idea of a Palestinian is a made-up concept itself. The conflict with respect to Arabs, people are exploiting the non-objective nature of international law because they're having their cake and eat it too. Because the law of armed conflict, in terms of the treaties that govern those actions by countries, presupposes the existence of armed conflict between states. And this is where people get to have their cake and eat it too, because technically, Hamas is not a government under international standards, and therefore Gaza is not a state. And therefore, therefore, the people who are anti-Semitic nihilists using the rubric of international law to give themselves a patina of cover for being anti-Semitic pro-Hamas nihilists. They're saying, okay, therefore LOAC doesn't apply to Israel. This is not a armed conflict between states. Therefore, Israel is held accountable to international humanitarian law. So Israel is being held accountable, for instance, to how, the United States has to provide due process for criminals under international norms and put people in prison and be proportional in that respect, and all those things that come from international human rights law. And that's where you're getting all of the condemnations. And one of the things that we learned in this mission is that a lot of the conflict of the kind of the existence of the conflict in the disputes over international law with Israel is a conflict between which of these two sources of international law people are choosing to apply. Because Israel very explicitly and deliberately says we are following the laws of armed conflict because we are treating Hamas and Hezbollah as effectively as military actions by a state, for all intents and purposes. And the UN and the Antonio Guterres and all these international so-called international law experts are saying, no, 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 you know, it's not a state. This is why they're refugees, and even though they live in technically they live in what they call Palestine, but they're still defined as refugees. It's not a state, and therefore, when they commit terrorist acts and you respond to that in a military way, this isn't a law of armed conflict. You are being held accountable to these much more stringent, much more strict requirements of international human rights, which is an invalid concept as it is because it's not defined in the context of individual rights. And that's the one that says, for instance, you don't get to blow up, like the police don't get to blow up a hospital because a criminal is inside a hospital. But if a military commander is using a hospital, in law of armed conflict says that military commander has turned the hospital into a valid military target. And and to the extent to which it doesn't mean you just carpet bomb the whole city, according to the law of armed conflict, but to the extent that you can attack that commander to kill that commander legitimately, then it is because he's a legitimate target, then you can bomb the hospital. And so you can see how, the non-objectivity of international law gives people this kind of arbitrary flexibility to go back and forth between different treaties and different so-called legal requirements of what Israel's supposed to act under, and how it gives this patina cover through international human rights law of the basis for why Israel is being attacked and criticized by the pro-Hamas segments in the West.
So therefore, I kind of want to ask you a question if you think there is sort of any place for international law and sort of to build it from, as I said, whenever somebody says, Israel violated international law, I like to try to look up the specific thing they're referring to and try to apply it. And one thing that brings to mind is at the start of the war, or sort of like in the first few weeks, people might remember that Israel basically evacuated all the Palestinians, I think at first from the north to the south, and then went into the north. And people were calling that as that was inhumane because you're moving people all around. But when you look at the specific things, it's like, well, that's what they were supposed to do. When I think it's Article like 49 in the Geneva Conventions for, it's like if you are sort of engaging in a war, you should try to basically move the civilian population to safe zones where you can. And it sort of shows me that whenever, and as you said, Israel really tries to uphold it and sort of goes oftentimes beyond what even would be required. And none of that is enough. It's sort of like no matter what Israel tries to do, how Israel tries to wage this war, none of it is enough. Do you think there is something Israel could do? There is like a world where
Because
the way, yeah.
no, because again, it's not enough because the people who are making these complaints are not making the complaints because they're advocates of international law. They're making these complaints because they're pro-Hamas and they're using international law, right, as a cover, right? And I know we're all shocked to hear that irrational, evil people lie and misrepresent their goals to achieve what they want to achieve in the world in terms of destruction and death. and in this case, genocidal anti-Semitism. Um, and the destruction of the West, because the reason why they're anti-Semitic is because Israelis and Jews in particular are kind of exemplars of a lot of the aspirational ideals and values of Western thought and Western civilization. And so, so the so really, yeah. I mean, the problem here is you're taking them on face value. You're taking these like, oh well, they're using international law and they're criticizing it, but they're just mistaken about it because there is these contexts, these other provisions that say you can. And again, this is you're you need to stop treating it like this is a valid dispute over valid, legitimate, like legal provisions. Like, oh well, what applies to a criminal, when they assault someone? Is it the definition of assault and battery under the criminal code in New York, or is it potentially attempted murder under another provision of the criminal code, and which should we apply? That's a legitimate objective discussion to have. That is not the conversation that we're having in the context of international law. Um, and so I think you just kind of that's what you're struggling with. Uh, and um, and the fact that you can arbitrarily shift back and forth between the two. And by the way, the Arabs who chose not to become Israeli citizens and chose to engage in a perpetual 70-year war against the state of Israel, supporting all of the, attacks on Israel by other states, in the various wars, the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War and so on and so on. They have deliberately exploited this. They have deliberately exploited this arbitrariness within international law for all of these purposes, so that this is why they get to attack Israel, engage in vile, barbaric atrocities, killing mothers, pregnant mothers, like just what happened a couple days ago, and then claim victimhood. And then be like, oh, you can't attack us, you can't bomb us, you can't do these things because international human law, international human rights, because we're not a state. So anytime that people are like getting to have their cake and eat it too, right? You now know you're no longer in the realm of kind of objective, fact-based conversations, and you have to recognize that. And that's kind of the key to understanding what's happening here and why Israel is being so easily attacked by those people who claim to be experts and advocates for international law.
Yeah, I should clarify that when I say I look things up, I don't assume that these people actually care for it. It's just interesting for me when somebody, points to something and try to see if Israel upholds it. And every time I checked, Israel pretty much always upholds it. And I
Well, like
realized, oh,
one
yeah.
of the abused, another example of this is the abuse of the concept of proportionality in international law, because that's in the LOAC, that's in the law of armed conflict, that that military actions need to be proportional. Now we actually learned how Israel like breaks that down into very strict requirements of how they engage in military actions, far beyond what they need to do and what any country does. I mean, I came out of that meeting, we all came out of that meeting with the IDF lawyers shocked that Israel is able to take any military action given the standards that they hold themselves to. But like, if you really think of it, like strictly speaking, like, oh, your actions can only be proportional. You can only engage in literally the exact proportional response that the people did to you. It's like, okay, then after October 7th, Israel was allowed to go into Gaza and slaughter, rape, and torture 1,400 Gazans because that's the proportional response, right? Once you understand the absurdity of the use of this proportionality concept as a cudgel, as an intellectual cudgel and moral cudgel that's used to beat up on Israel, then you start to understand how arbitrary all of this is. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to add something on the proportionality, my understanding was that people completely misunderstand the concept that sort of proportionality only implies to the attacks themselves. Basically, like we said, the hospital or sort of
Right.
civilian area, that sort of the military gain should be sort of proportional to the risk you're taking to the civilian enemy side. So you don't blow up one ammo crate
Yeah.
together with like 100,000 civilians.
So within the military, proportionality is a legitimate concept. They think in terms of proper use of military force in the context in which what are our objectives, what is potential collateral damage, and things of this sort, right? What are we trying to achieve, and is this effectively achieve our goals, or and things of this sort. So in that context, it's fine, and that's kind of what they're leveraging, because every arbitrary or evil concept kind of leverages a element or some out of context factual legitimate concept or fact as a way to kind of sustain itself, to give it validity or legitimacy to to the people who are innocent, who don't understand, and therefore are being taken advantage of or exploited by the use of the arbitrary concept. So in that sense, and how you're describing it, and how and what I just described, that's legitimate, right? It is appropriate for generals to think, okay, is this action consistent with what our overall strategic goals are? Is this action consistent with, effective use of force in terms of what we're trying to achieve in this war with an enemy? And this is kind of a little bit. So the reason why this is called law is because it evolved out of what was called for a very long time the law of nations. And this comes from this kind of tripartite structure from natural law theory going back to the Romans and Cicero. And this is foundational to the evolution of the concept of natural rights and the concept of individual rights eventually. So they had this kind of tripartite structure. They said that, well, there's the natural law, which is the moral, which is morality, moral rules, and then there's civil law, which implements the natural law in social contexts, but it's not a one-to-one implementation. And Cicero actually has an example of this, which is kind of cool. His example is, even though it's immoral to lie, you can't make illegal lying. And he goes through various reasons why, that, what I mean is lying as such, it's just so you just lie to a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a friend or a family member about something, you may have committed a moral transgression, but it's not deserves to be part of the law. It's not something that you haven't violated their rights. Now, lying can rise to a violation of rights, like fraud and things like that, right? And these are the difficult issues of why you need legal philosophy and jurisprudence to kind of help bridge the gap from moral principles to individual rights to law. But the but the so they understood this, right? But they weren't being objective about it, right? So this is the problem: is the natural law is kind of an intrinsicist concept, and then they recognize that there's certain aspects of natural law, like prohibition of murder, that's shared between all countries. All countries prohibited murder. So they refer to these shared civil laws that reflect what they saw as reflecting the natural law as the law of nations. And this concept was implemented originally by Rome as a way to kind of govern relationships between different subjects and citizens of different countries, because the Roman law only applied to Romans. So what do you do when an Egyptian comes to Rome and commits a crime? You can't apply the Roman law to the Egyptian at that time, because the Egyptian didn't have because the Roman law. So they had actual special courts that applied the law of nations. They would say, okay, what's the shared law between Egypt and Rome? So it's the law of nations that comes to be the basis of what we now understand as international law. And this is developed further. In fact, the founders of natural rights theory, Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf, who heavily influenced and are the intellectual forefathers to John Locke, are themselves recognized as the founders of international law. Hugo Grotius is actually recognized as the father of international law in his various treatises, in which he was expounding the first original modern theory of natural rights. Um, and um, and so, in a certain sense, this is why they're calling it law, because it was coming from this tripartite structure. And in the Latin, jus has two meanings. It means right, and it means law. And so, you know, you don't have, it's not until Ayn Rand and the theory of objectivity and the concepts are not intrinsic in the world, right, that you finally get an understanding and a disentangling of these concepts that were very confused between them. And international law, which starts as a generally kind of not a generally good concept in the sense of law of nations, it's the foundation for of individual rights and of natural rights, ends up becoming perverted because of these errors in it that become exploited, and then people start to think of it as law like we mean in English law, as opposed from right.
So we're kind of running out of time. I had many more questions. Also wanted to
I'm
run
sorry, I've
by.
been going on a bit. So
No, no worries. This is really good. I also had questions about ICC and ICJ. Maybe we can cover that some other time because there is one more sort of question I would have. And
yeah,
I mean, you mentioned how Israel tries to uphold international law. And my sort of question would be, is that sort of a just or a moral goal? And one thing that comes to mind is I'm not sure if you've ever sort of read about General Sherman and the way he waged through the South during the Civil War,
Mhm.
and that was brutal. You couldn't like what he was doing to the South. He understood it as that was what was necessary to basically finally finish this horrible war that should have never been started. And you need to bring the reality of the war to basically to ordinary people so they realize what has happened. And one of the criticism of his from the Confederate generals was that he was going against the idea of civilized warfare. I think specifically civilized warfare was like a line that was being used. And I found it like really interesting to comparison to yeah, basically sort of the way the so-called international law is being used against Israel. And even Israel itself is trying to uphold it, while I think to the extent they are trying to do it, it really makes it impossible to actually wage a proper war against not Hamas, because even if you destroy Hamas, it won't be enough. You need to destroy this idea within Palestinians that starting a war is something that's just you can do, and it's like an okay. It's like, do you want to live in a civilized society or do you want to start a war? And that these two choices are somehow, morally equal, or sort of like will not have giantly different consequences.
yeah, yeah. Um, so you're getting at a really important point, which is kind of, what's the function of war for a good country, a good country like Israel or a good country like the United States. And because we don't seek out wars, wars are imposed on us, like World War II was, and like the war with Arabs that has been constantly imposed on Israel. As Israel constantly likes to say, we don't start wars, but we end them. They don't, but they haven't ended them, and that's been part of the problem. War, it can't be fought under current international law requirements, even LOAC. It just almost everything that the Allies did in World War II is a violation of the laws of war. The strategic bombing campaigns, the use of the nuclear weapon or the atomic weapons on Japan to end the war, but Sherman is right. War is hell. Part of the war, a function of war is to break your enemy, not to make them, if they are, you can't culturally change them, you can't intellectually change them, but you have to make it real to them what the nature of their choices as a country and as a culture, and what the nature of their choices as a government have done in terms of being an aggressor and attacking irrationally and evilly other countries and killing people. And so you have to not just defeat them, in terms of on the battlefield, you have to defeat them politically and culturally. And that is why World War II really was for all intents and purposes, was the very last kind of successful war that was ever fought, in terms of we effectively, unconditionally destroyed Nazi Germany and Japan and Imperial Japan. And we made it just real to them. This is what will happen. This is what happens to you when you start this. We did what Sherman did in the March through the South, where he sought the point of the March to the Sea was to break the spirit, not just to defeat them militarily, but to make it real to them. They have lost. that this is not a just cause, this is not a good cause, and this is a self-destructive cause that will bring them agony and death every single time. And that is what we effectively conveyed to Japan and Germany. It's not, people talk about how like, oh, the Arab world is so complex and we don't understand all of these. Guess what? In 1930s, Japan was more alien to us in the West than the Middle East is to us today. We know more about the Middle East today than the average Americans and the American government knew about Japan in the 1930s. It was that alien of a culture. And what is it now? Now today, Japan's one of our greatest allies, and it's one of the greatest Western countries in Asia. Right? And that's not a coincidence. That is not a coincidence. We destroyed that country and then we rebuilt it. We showed them the way and we ran it for a long time. MacArthur was basically a dictator in Japan for 5 or 6 years. We said, here's your constitution. Here's what you're going to do. And we banned Shintoism, just like we banned Nazism in Germany and things of this sort, because this is what you need to do. And the problem is that what international law creates now is perpetual war. And we've seen this with Israel. It prevents countries from doing what's necessary to effectively bring an end to an enemy combatant, because it's this worship of ceasefires of, well, don't attack them so much that you actually end up causing too many problems for their citizens and things of this sort. No, there can't be any collateral damage. And at the end of the day, what ends up happening is some country engages in conflict and then the UN and other officials sweep in and say, oh, but you can't be too aggressive and you got to follow all these rules and don't, so-called proportionality. And then the conflict doesn't get resolved. And then there's some type of armistice or ceasefire in the way that there was an armistice after World War I, right? Which just perpetuated the conflict until World War II happened, right? And so they have basically, through all of the creation of modern international law, the international law of human rights combined with the law of armed conflict, have created perpetual war for countries where they just don't allow resolution of armed conflicts anymore in the way that they need to be resolved. And the only way a conflict is resolved is if the enemy is broken, if the enemy is completely and utterly defeated, in the way that when William the Conqueror in 1066 came and destroyed the Anglo-Saxons and completely replaced them 100%. The way that we destroyed Germany and Japan. These are the key, the way that Rome destroyed Carthage and things of this sort. It was when countries stop doing that is when they end up in perpetual conflicts.
Yeah, and my favorite or sort of an example of this is the Golan Heights. The fact that people should know that Israel has been holding on to Golan Heights for longer than Syria ever did, yet it's still an illegal occupation under international law. And I assume will be pretty much forever. Like there is no resolution, right? Unless sort of what Israel gives up a few of its citizens to like an Islamist regime. That's sort of like a just resolution. And on the occupation part, I remember seeing a really interesting video of young American went to Japan and asked an old Japanese man if he feels resentment towards Americans. And his response was something like, no, when I was a child, we went to English schools, and whoever revered the old regime or whoever wanted to bring it back was a sucker. You're a loser. You lost to someone greater than you. Adopt the new ways. Something you've done before was wrong, and now you need to change your ways. And unless we see something similar within Palestinians, we are looking forward to basically the same kind of thing. We have a few super chats. Pony, thank you so much. Amit, thank you so much. He says, if not, or he asks, if not by international law, by what standard or what should bound the acts of military during conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. And at the end of the day, and the answer is Rand's essay at the Ethics of Emergencies, where she makes it very clear that morality and the ethical theory more generally applies only in the context where human life as a human, as an organism who can pursue values, is possible. And wars are emergency situations. Wars are, I'm being attacked. I need to defend myself. I need to stop plowing my fields or building new products in the factories and or going to the office. I need to pick up a weapon to defend myself and and my way of life in terms of living that life that I'm trying to pursue. So it's an emergency situation. And so you have questions of efficacy in terms of like, what are we trying to achieve in this context? But at the end of the day, the ultimate goal is we need to eliminate the enemy, we need to eliminate the threat and eliminate it, not just push it off to the side, push it back far enough away so it's now 100 miles away instead of 10 miles away. You need to eliminate the threat or it will come back because if they haven't learned the lesson that they can't attack with impunity, then they'll keep attacking because, um, so it is an interesting question. Like, how do you then engage in these issues? And this is why we have generals and experts on military, use of force and things of this sort. In the same way that we have, as I mentioned earlier, we need like jurisprudence, experts in jurisprudence to kind of help translate the more abstract ideal principles of morality into law. You need experts on military tactics and theory and in theory to understand like, okay, what is the most effective way to do this? At what point is it barbarism versus an appropriate use of force to achieve an effective end to a conflict? You know, that's an interesting question, and this is why we have experts in military technology and military theory to apply to think these things through.
We also have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. She says, "Thank you, Adam, for the identification of Arab for Palestinians, using it from now on." Thank you so much. And with that, sorry, Adam, I kept you a bit longer. Any
Oh, that's
last
fine.
thoughts?
Yeah.
Any last thoughts, and where can people find you if they would like to follow?
Oh, thank you. So, well, thank you for having me on, Daniel. It's always a pleasure to be chatting with you and Razi. So you can find me on X. I'm Adam Mossoff handle, where I talk about Israel and these issues a lot. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm on surprisingly TikTok and YouTube Shorts and stuff with the Mossoff Minute. But that's more my intellectual property and innovation policy that I am an expert in, and I actually have very definitive thoughts on, and don't defer to experts on because I am one.
And we have one more super chat from Knows Too Much. He says, "Thanks, Adam, for explaining this topic so clearly that even the mindless pro-Palestinian drones can understand, but they'll continue to ignore facts." I
Yes.
think we've left the realm of facts a long time ago, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, after this, we have the reality show coming up. We're actually going to be talking about who are the Palestinians. Yesterday, there was the Nakba Day, and you had the squad bringing out the new legislation to recognize Nakba. So that's one of the things we'll be talking about.
Yes.
But
I did an ex post on that because, yeah, Representative Tlaib introduced a resolution in the House about the Nakba and condemning the genocide in Gaza. And I did a post on her saying, imagine if in 1943 we had Nazi sympathizers spreading Nazi propaganda on the floor of Congress as members of Congress. And I said, it's shameful that in 2025 that's reality. Um, yeah. But or as or another meme that I like to see on X is that sometimes people will like tout out like Sinwar and stuff and be like, they lived as a Palestinian and they died as a Palestinian. And they were not Sinwar, but the guy who was killed in Iran. The
Hania?
yeah, Vanya. Yeah, there's like he was born in Egypt and he was died in Iran. This is yeah, I mean in fact, this whole idea of Palestine is this concoction actually of Soviet propaganda in the 1960s, when they decided to back Yasser Arafat. They concocted this whole narrative of Israel as this colonial, imperialist, capitalist threat against the local, natives. Yeah, and it's just and the fact that this continues is shocking. Well, not shocking. It's not shocking, but it's just but it's shocking, but not surprising, I should say, actually. Yeah.
So people can join us on the reality show in just about a minute or so. Thank you again, Adam, for
Yeah.
joining me, and we'll see you in a bit. Bye
All
bye.
right. Thanks, Daniel.